Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. There are few political crises around the world to rival Venezuela's. Ever since President Maduro's election in 2013 and his subsequent power grab, the country has been plunged into an economic freefall. Ordinary Venezuelans have lived in extreme poverty for years amid rising crime levels and food shortages. It's estimated over 3 million people have fled, many to neighboring Colombia. Until very recently, there have been no signs of improvement amid a tense political standoff between Maduro and the opposition leader Juan Guaido. But it is all about to change. We have two guest speakers today that say there may be some room for optimism amid some new opportunities to ease the crisis. Our guests are Renata Segura, Deputy Director for the Latin America and Caribbean with the International Crisis Group. Hello, Renata.
Hi, Nick. How are you? Sorry, I was muted for a moment.
Okay, we got you there.
Good to join you this morning.
Renata, I think you're in New York, and we also have Yesman Utrera, a well-known Caracas-based journalist who's been reporting from Venezuela throughout the crisis. Hello, Yesman.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us. For those of us who are less familiar with what's been happening in Venezuela, I thought it'd be useful just to provide a brief recap of events, but also to outline what ordinary Venezuelans have had to endure really over the last 8 years or so. So let's start with you, Yesman. Before we get on to what's changing at the moment, just remind us that the sort of terrible economic downfall Venezuela's gone through and what impact that's had on ordinary people.
Well, yeah, basically what ordinary Venezuelans have been facing in the last couple of years, it's very tough. Since 2015, we've been experiencing a lot of scarcity. The economic measures of the government have been brutal for the working classes. The scarcity in 2016 was led to 80% of hunger crisis, like people were eating just once a day. And I remember back then, we're reporting lots of kids dying of malnutrition. Lots of people live in the country for that. And if I may correct, you say around 3 million people have left the country. The numbers say that about 5 million have left the country already.
Yeah.
So, and as I was discussing with you previously, people who have left the country not only looking for better opportunities for themselves, but also as a way to try to help the ones they leave behind in Venezuela, right? So scarcity was one thing. And then in the recent years, scarcity has gone to give the space for what we call the dollarisation, where all the prices are anchored to the US dollar. Now we don't have scarcity, but the big issue here is that most of the people's wage is not anchored to the dollar, which means that most of the Venezuelans are making only $3 or $4 a month. And obviously that's not enough to afford food. Like a kilogram of meat, for example, can be easily $3, and you cannot eat for a whole month with a single kilogram of meat.
Yeah.
The other situation, and sorry to interrupt you, Venezuelans are dealing with is a huge increase in violence. A couple of days ago, we saw a shooting in the capital of Venezuela, where a criminal group decided to have a display of their power and their gun power in the capital of the city, very near to the presidential palace. After that came a massive police operation to stop them, and they found a crazy amount of ammunition, AK-47s, missile launchers, grenades, and even an ocelot, a pet ocelot, and a baby crocodile there. So roughly, that's the background Venezuelans are dealing with to this day.
So, and just sort of picking up on what you were saying there. So, I mean, I was reading about this earlier, that the drop in incomes, the going from about $12,000 a year to 1,500. I mean, those are sort of general figures, but a 90% drop in incomes is colossal. But then the uncertainty in queuing for food that doesn't exist, and what you're saying now is that there is food, but for very many people, it's just unaffordable. So if you've got access to dollars and if you've got money coming from family abroad, you might be okay. But for many, many people, it's a pretty dire situation. Renata, I'd love to turn to you. Can you just remind us how we got here? There was an election back in 2013. What happened after that?
Yes, Nick. Well, obviously, what is happening in Venezuela for the last decade or so is sort of the unraveling of the model of socialism of the 21st century, as President Hugo Chavez called it. Chavez, as you may recall, died in 2013, and he appointed Nicolas Maduro as his successor. And with the arrival of Maduro to power, I'm not saying that 100% is his fault for having arrived at power then, but the economy was already deteriorating quite significantly before that. But since 2013 is when at least we're marking the start of the recession in Venezuela properly. There is one problem that many people who study Venezuela have, which is that the government provides almost no data on the economics in particular. There's very little information out there that can help us to concretely do a diagnosis. But we know that the economy shrank between 2014 and 2019 in over 3/4 of the economy disappeared, essentially. That's how brutal the recession was. Hyperinflation has been one of the most difficult things for Venezuelans to face daily. For 2018, the inflation was over 1,698,000. It meant that products actually doubled in price around every 19 days in average. And as you were saying earlier, this plunged the country that had been traditionally one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America into severe poverty. 94% of Venezuelans live under the poverty line and 79% under the extreme poverty line. This is all very tied to the role of the oil industry. Venezuela has obviously massive amounts of oil and has always depended on the oil. It has the curse of the resource state because the oil had provided so much wealth to Venezuelans that there wasn't that much diversification. And during the government of Hugo Chavez, a problem began after there was a massive strike from PDVSA, which is the national oil company. And after that strike, a lot of the people that worked there were replaced by just supporters of Chavez that were not necessarily professionals on the oil field. And in the attempts for redistribution that Chavez's government engaged with, and we have to acknowledge that he did raise out of poverty a lot of people during his mandate, but he did it a lot by taking the money from the oil industry and putting it directly into social services, social programs, but by not reinvesting in the oil industry, which has meant that the oil industry essentially has collapsed. There was, in 1998, we had 40,000 employees, more or less, and producing 3 million barrels a day. In 2016, there were 146,000 employees producing less than that at around 2.57 million. And added to that, obviously, you have the collapse of the oil prices at several points, particularly now with COVID. So it's been a very little capacity to produce, in addition to oil prices. And in addition, the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed on the Venezuelan government that impedes it to sell oil to other partners if they don't want to face sanctions from the U.S. Okay. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll stop there.
No, that's right. I mean, and it's worth adding that, I mean, Venezuela's got the world's largest oil reserve. So, it emphasizes how much of a tragedy it is. Thank you both very much. I think it's a really good sort of recap of where the country is economically and how ordinary people have been hit. Let's talk a bit about who the international, the US, the EU, and the UK have backed. And that's the opposition figure, Juan Guaido, who declared himself interim president in 2019. But there's really been a sort of tense political standoff, and arguably that hasn't worked. Renata, can you just talk a bit about him and what the West, for want of a better word, has been trying to do?
Sure. So in 2015, the opposition won the elections, essentially not the parliamentary elections, and they took control of Congress. It was the first time that really, since 1998, that a non-Chavista movement won. And we have to understand that a lot of this was a reaction to the economic crisis that the country was facing. After the government obviously didn't react too well to losing Congress. It was a big blow, and part of the way in which Chavismo has worked is to have a state that doesn't control or check and balances, but rather than implements. And so Juan Guaido was, there was like rather complicated, but to put it very briefly, like a dual congresses, right? Like the Congress, the government refused to acknowledge the existence of the elected National Assembly, and then the National Assembly kept saying, we are the ones that have been legitimately elected, so we're going to exist. So there was like a parallel government, we can say. And Juan Guaido was the one, was the person leading the National Assembly that was sort of seen as the traditional opposition. The problem is that the opposition has refused to participate in elections thereafter because they very fairly argue they are not going to be just and fair, and so they don't want to give legitimacy to a process that they don't feel it's fair. But by not participating, it means that there is a National Assembly that is at least sort of the constitutionally one that is now not in control of the opposition anymore. The elections are completely, there's a lot of fraud, they're not transparent, they're not legitimate, but they are the elections that the country has. So for many years, the international community really looked at Guaido as the head of the country. They recognized him as the legitimate president, and there was this bipolar sort of situation with two heads of state. But recently, especially since the last elections of last December, when there is another National Assembly elected, it's not very strong on opposition, but there were some people that from the opposition that participated. The international community has been less enthusiastic about supporting Guaido as the head of government. They haven't removed the acknowledgement from him as the legitimate president, but there is also sort of a more facing the facts that this other assembly is not really in power or playing the role that a legislation should normally have.
Okay. Okay, that's where we are politically, and I'm going to come back to you in a second, Renata, just to say why there might be. Basically, you've described sort of there's a sort of polarity here. You've got Maduro's government, his, as you say, constitutionally elected assembly, and they've got their governors. You've got the president there, and then Guaido's also got his own governors, his own assembly. There's a sort of a mirror image of each other. So there's a split down the middle. So let's sort of bank that for a moment. We'll come back to what you think might be a possibility of rooms for progress, rooms for possible political solution or agreement there, particularly with Washington involved. We'll come back to that in a second. But Yesman, can we just come back to you, what you were saying about what's happening in ordinary Venezuelans' lives now? You talked about the dollarization of the economy. What impact is that having? And does that make people more happy with the government? What are their reactions politically? Do they just get on with their daily lives? Is there no interest in politics? How does that play out?
Yeah, well, politically, what we see on the average Venezuelan is it's a huge apathy. They're not willing to participate. There's been so many struggles between government and opposition, and all of them have led to the same thing: economic crisis, political instability, which for them only means their lives get a lot worse. For example, right now, the average Venezuelan is dealing with a gasoline crisis. You have to spend 1 or 2 days in a line in order to fill your tank, which is not very good, as you can imagine. Then for food, I mean, on one hand, they're really happy they don't have to do this unending, never-ending lines to get food. There's food everywhere, but at the same time, they feel frustrated they cannot get it because, for example, a package of corn flour, which is a very elementary part of our diet, it's $1. And if you're making $3 or $4 a month, it means that a quarter of your income will go away just buying a kilogram of corn flour, which is really, really frustrating for them. also in terms of political instability, when Juan Guaido proclaimed himself as the interim president, everybody felt that was a moment, a very good moment for the country, and they all wanted to support Juan Guaido. And there was massive demonstrations on the street saying, we want change, we don't want Nicolas Maduro anymore, that it's okay. But all that energy, all that, empowerment people had back then was reduced almost to zero now, because all the manifestations were experienced a brutal repression from the government. There was no space for negotiation. There was no results at the end. It was just Juan Guaido has an interim presidency with no power. Nicolas Maduro has an actual president with all the power, the army, and all this also armed groups like the colectivos, like the one we talked about a while ago. So in general, I would say most Venezuelans are just trying to survive. In Venezuela.
I'll come back to that. Yesman was talking about an incident last week in which there was an armed, or basically a gang that controls an area in Caracas called Cota 905. Let's talk about that very briefly. Yesman, what was the story behind that? Because I was shocked by this. I thought this was basically gang violence, a gang trying to assert its authority. But you were telling me how it's set up and where it's got its power from.
Well, yeah, basically when Chavez came to power, he was loved. It was around 80% people supported the government of Chavez. And it was very easy for him to get the support of the popular sectors. We call it here the cerros, the hills, right? Because that's where the working classes live. But then after Chavez died, these people started feeling unrest about the economic measures, about all the hyperinflation, about the scarcity. And traditionally, we say that the governments in Venezuela are over once the hills come down, meaning that when the working classes are done with the government, it's over, and they just all come down in a massive demonstration and overthrow the government. The government of Nicolas Maduro knew this from the beginning, and they started negotiating with the people in control of these popular sectors. In some places, they negotiated with the colectivos, and they gave them some guns. Okay, I'll give you these guns in exchange of you keep this territory, free of anti-government demonstrations. And in some other territories, like the Cota 905, there were criminal structure already there, and they negotiated with the government as well. Okay, I'll stay out of your way. I won't go to your territory. And the Cota 905 was a place where police was not allowed. At all, not for patrolling, nothing at all. No single policeman could enter this place. And it was for the same reason. Okay, I'll stay out of your business as long as in your territory there's no anti-government manifestation, demonstrations, or whatsoever. So keep that territory calm, and I'll keep you safe there, right? But at some point earlier this year, this criminal gang started having some friction with the police forces. And it led to what we saw a couple of days ago, where they say, okay, I have some power and I'm going to show it to you. And then the government say, oh, I have power too. And these two powers collided. The government said that these armed groups were supported by the oppositionists. And yesterday we saw how they took the Congressman Freddy Guevara for that. And they charged him with terrorism, incitation of hate, and all this made up allegations against a political force, but in general, it's just a way to get another hostage for negotiating.
Yeah, you were referring to the arrest of Guaido's sort of right-hand man in a way, his lawyer very closely associated with him, who's a congressman who was arrested on the streets yesterday. I guess that would be a big blow for the opposition. Renata, as Ian Drury would say, reasons to be cheerful. What are they?
I mean, I think those of us who follow Venezuela, we tend to get excited with small things just because there's been so little room for maneuver. So I don't want to present this as really we're seeing a massive breakthrough. And I think Yesman will agree with me that we're all very sort of at this point cynical and trying to take things at one time. I mean, it is important to know that Maduro has all of the cards in his hand, right? Like,
Yeah.
he won the election massively, I mean, because the opposition didn't participate. And the Trump administration and some other regional governments, such as the one of Colombia, had put on the table the idea of maximum pressure, meaning they were going to really try and force a coup or people going on the streets to get Maduro out of power, and that didn't happen. So essentially, Maduro won, right? He won against Trump and the others, and he won against the opposition, and he has like all of the power, as Yesman was saying, is in his hands. Interestingly, I think, because he's in that position of power and the government is, though, he's been signaling that he's willing to do some concessions that might lead to a more fair election. And so the little steps that he has taken are fairly small, but given the kind of recalcitrant position that they've had taken until now, they are meaningful. For once, they allow the World Food Program into Venezuela to try and help with the humanitarian crisis.
That's already started, so food is being delivered to parts of the country.
Yes, I mean, it's a rather small it's a small project that they began with, and they're mostly focusing on children in the schools. But the important thing is that Venezuela had never allowed the international community to come in with humanitarian aid, despite the very clear need for humanitarian aid to come into the country. It was an issue that was very politicized. It was always like Colombia and Guaido were trying to make a big deal out of it, and so the Maduro administration had always been very reluctant to let them come in to help its people, because he saw it would mean losing politically. So allowing the WFP to come into the country is a very important sign. The other thing that he did is that the National Council for Elections, which is the body that really organizes and makes sure that the elections are run properly, were re-elected, and two of the people that were elected there are part of the opposition. This is what I mean when I say it's very small incremental steps, but considering that elections are sort of the core issue on what the next step can be, if we're trying to have a transition via democratic means, it is very important that there are two people from the opposition, actually people that are very well respected in Venezuela and very well known. So that indicates that perhaps there is and the intention, at least, to have the elections in December, which are parliamentary, to be a little bit more clean and transparent than what we've had until now.
And in response, perhaps there has been something from Washington. I mean, there's a big shortage of cooking fuel.
Yeah.
And I gather there was some change on sanctions on that front.
Yes, actually, yesterday the U.S. administration came out with a like, it's not a lifting of a sanction, but it's allowing Venezuela to exchange oil for cooking oil. And the other big issue that we're still not getting there, but that we've been really advocating for, is allowing Venezuela to do exchange of oil for diesel, which is really needed, particularly for the trucks that are bringing the food from the countryside into the cities, to be able to do that, because there hasn't been diesel, and so the food has been rotting. There's very little food that is produced in Venezuela, but the little that there is really difficult to get it to the cities. Plus, obviously, ambulances and all the other transportation means.
So Renata, can you see a change in thinking? Obviously, the sanctions have had a significant effect on the country. The country has been plunged into poverty, and as you said, a lot of that is due to this mismanagement of the economy, but certainly sanctions have piled it on. Is there a sense now in Washington, in the Biden administration, that in actual fact, is this helping to produce any kind of political settlement? Where are sanctions leading? Are they just hitting the poorest? What's your sense?
I think we've seen less from Biden than we were hoping in terms of change of policy, and I think there's still a lot of inertia from the traditional take that the Trump administration but others have taken. There have been clear hints, as specifically saying we will consider the lifting of sanctions. But Nick, the problem is that there is a very big and powerful Venezuelan exile community in Florida. Florida is a key state for Democrats. They cannot get that exile pissed off. And those exiles are very, very opposed to the lifting of sanctions because they think that we need to continue this maximum pressure on the administration to get out. So there is a very difficult play within Washington in which I think the Biden administration and the people close to him understand that the sanctions really have not produced what they were hoping, and that in particular some have really hurt the Venezuelan people in their day-to-day basis. But the problem is that short of announcing an invasion, which I don't think the US is thinking at any moment, sanctions are the really only tool that the government has to put significant pressure on Maduro. So I think there is an understanding that this is changing, but the lack of tools to really try and push Maduro forward, it complicates the issues. That's why it's so important to really try and give support to the possibility of a negotiation between Maduro and the opposition, such as the one that Norway is trying to restart with the support of the European Union. The US seems to want to be a little bit more on the margins of that process, but it seems to us that a negotiation between all of the parts, and by all of the parts, we really need to have a lot of representatives from the opposition, which is significantly divided in Venezuela, and that's a big part of the problem. That would, if we have a table of negotiations going, then the US will be in a better position to be able to say, okay, we'll lift this and that sanction if we see movement in A, B, and C. Without the table, it seems a little hard.
Let me just explain for those who don't know, International Crisis Group has been going on, has existed for well over 2 decades. I think it's had its birth in the Balkans, trying to help with the crisis there. And they look at crises, they look at conflicts around the world. They warn when conflicts are emerging. And then as those conflicts are ongoing, they try and find solutions to them. It's well worth looking at their website. It's crisis. It used to be crisisweb.org. Is it still crisisweb.org?
It is. I think it's crisisgroup.org.
Crisisgroup.org. Okay, crisisgroup.org. It is well worth looking at, and they've got a very good question. They've got a very good page on Venezuela. So do have a look at that. Please, everyone, start putting your questions in the Q&A box below here, or wherever it is on your screen. And then we can start putting your questions to the panelists. So Yesman, that raises an interesting question: is why would it be in Maduro's interest to have these kind of negotiations that the International Crisis Group are, backing, encouraging to have the kind of talks that Norway has been in favor of? Why would Maduro want to do this? I presume to ease sanctions a bit, but what has he got to gain from that kind of process?
Yeah, I think the only goal of Maduro to have this negotiation is to lift the sanctions, and the other is to get the international recognition. He's dealt with this very, very bad image all abroad the world, and he's at some point they even call him the butcher, Maduro, back in 2017 with all the protests that led to repression. Right, so I think his international image, the government's in general international image, is very damaged, and he expects by letting or allowing this negotiation to fix that a little bit. But in the past, Venezuela has had other negotiations with the opposition, and as Renata explained very well, the opposition is divided in the government. There are many factors of power inside the government, but when it comes to a statement or when it comes to a negotiation, they're a block. They're always united. They're undivided, and that's a huge problem. In the past, we've had negotiations with Norway also acting as an intermediate level operator, but these negotiations led to nothing. Like the government say, okay, yeah, I'll respect the elections, of course, I'll welcome everybody. Yeah, we can have the fairest elections on earth. Then the next movement you see is that they cheat, they buy votes, they do whatever they want, pretty much. So as we say in Spanish, paper can hold everything, but we want to see facts. My personal point of view of this is that the opposition will try to go to reactivate that figure of a referendum on 2022, because as Renata said, I mean, all the cards on Nicolas Maduro's hands. The opposition has nothing. That's how I see it personally. The fact that we have two oppositionist rectors in the electoral center, it means very little as well, and we have seen it in practice. When, for example, one of these rectors said a couple of weeks ago, okay, the government is using public funds to finance their campaign. And then one of the principal figures of power in the country, Diosdado Cabello, said, watch out with what you say or you go to jail, pretty much, right? So what kind of power can they have?
Electoral body, isn't it? It's the body that oversees the elections.
Yeah, the electoral center is the body that rules the election. It is very important. I reckon that we have two rectors, two oppositionist rectors is rather unheard in the last couple years, but what does it mean in real terms, we'll still have to see.
Okay, now I've got to badger people for those questions. They're being a bit slow today, but do put them down in the Q&A box there, and we can get those coming in. There was an interesting incident in the Cape Verde Islands recently. Yesman, can you tell us a bit about this? Because I think this also, it's a sort of clash of wills between different courts. There's a chap that, well, you'll tell us about him in a second, a guy who touched down in a private jet in the Cape Verde Islands. And it also says something about Venezuela's international supporters and links. So just tell us about what happened there.
In Haiti, you mean?
No, in the Cape Verde Islands with the there's a guy called Saab who was detained there.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't understand. Yeah, that's Alex Saab. The government claims that Alex Saab, to give you a rough picture of Alex Saab, he's been very close to Maduro's government, and basically he's in charge of washing the money, pretty much, or as we could say more in a more diplomatic way, to securing negotiations between the government and other economic institutions. The government claims Alex Saab it's a diplomat and he shouldn't be detained in Cape Verde. And the US government is also asking Cape Verde to send Alex Saab for extradition, but it's like we call it in Venezuela, it's something that won't move. It's stuck there. I don't know what to do with it.
Saying that Saab was in a private jet, possibly on the way to Iran to secure more oil supplies from Iran. Was that it?
Yeah, well, you know, Venezuela, since the sanctions have taken power, Venezuela can only have business with countries like Iran, Russia, China, India. So Alex Saab is the person in charge of, okay, I'll give you oil in exchange of food, for example. They say he's got a chain of supermarkets here in Venezuela. It's called Salva Market. It's just basically, and there's papers on this. You can check in Armando Info about how he has laundered money for decades for the government. So,
okay, now just to add another layer of complication, Renata, there's obviously the refugees who have fled in large numbers to Colombia, but also there's an insurgency along the border between Colombia and Venezuela. Can you tell us a bit about what's happening there?
Yeah, the border between Colombia and Venezuela has always been a complicated, sort of lawless space. Both Venezuela and Colombia are fairly centralist states, and you know, the border region is far away from their capitals and has traditionally been sort of abandoned. Historically, the Colombian guerrillas that were involved in the internal conflict would go to Venezuela, sort of like attack the army and then hide in Venezuela. They did the same with Ecuador. But in the last few years, particularly since the demobilization of the FARC after 2016 peace process, what we have seen is really the ELN has started to really act in Venezuela. So it's the first time really in the history of South America where you have a proper kind of transnational rebel group having activities continuously across the border, and in particular, like there's a lot of illegal gold mines in that area. So the ELN, which is very involved in illegal mining in Colombia, has also been trying to be active there. Besides the ELN, there's also criminal organizations that are, you know, they don't have even a political facade, or they don't pretend to be political at all. which are narco trafficking organizations, but not exclusively. They also make money with other kinds of illicit economy, timber, etc. And so they've been acting in this area particular because there's very little law enforcement. But the complicated part recently, in particular with what happened in Apure a few months ago, is that the relationship between particularly the ELN and some of the Colombian groups and the armed forces in Venezuela is sort of not clear and transparent. The ELN, because of ideological affinity with the Maduro administration, has always been kind of protected by the government and not attacked when they have gone to Venezuela. But recently we've seen what we think are divisions within the military in Venezuela that are not so thrilled, understandably, to see a bunch of foreign criminal groups and obviously also criminal groups from Venezuela take over this space and sort of, kind of become a contenders to the state. So there has been attacks to some of the groups. There's a lot of rumors that because the guerrilla now is split in Colombia with some of the dissidents from the FARC, that perhaps it was an attack against some of the people that fight against the dissidences because they want to strengthen one group or another. It's very messy, but like in one line, it's criminal organizations, guerrilla groups, and some actors of some sectors of the military forces really trying to take control of these territories where there is a lot of illicit economy, which is a great source of income.
So I'm gonna go to questions in a second. The questions are coming in now, but just to follow that up, I mean, both in terms of the police trying to reassert themselves in the capital, and I'm thinking about the military getting fed up with the ELN. Is there a sense that the state is more confident that if the economy has stabilized slightly, they feel that they've got the greater ability to assert control or assert their authority?
I would say there is. I mean, the government, if I look at it in the last 10 years, the biggest problem of the government is not that they don't have control of the guns, for example, of the violence. Is not that they don't have that sort of control. The only problem is that the economy was so bad that it was something people could not bear. I mean, they were even willing to lose their lives to go and demonstrate against the government because they were literally dying, right? They were starving, right? But now that since the economy has improved a little bit, I would say, and this might be a controversial opinion, that the government feels even more clinged into power. They feel like, okay, they feel confident, to use your own words. And this is why, for example, Cota 905, as we speak, there was criminal activities there for decades. I mean, it's not something new. And this is not the first shooting we have in the capital. They have kidnapped, they have had a couple more shootings, they have killed policemen inside that place, and the government never touched them, right? They dare to do it because they feel, okay, everything's fine, I don't think people's gonna demonstrate over it. And they did it fast and with a lot of contingency. They sent 8,000 policemen to take over this land, so there was no room for mistakes there was no room. They were knocking house by house trying to find. Ironically, they didn't find the leaders of the criminal leaders of this organization.
Just a wildcat and some guns.
Just the ocelot and the baby crocodile.
Right.
Yes, but yeah, I do feel that the government it's in a very good position to try it and do this kind of operations.
Okay, fascinating. Let's take some questions now. Let's start with Simon Jackson. Go ahead, Simon.
Well, is there still two questions? Is there still a flow of economic migrants out of the country over the land border, and if so, is the government concerned and doing much about it? And secondly, what is the state of the special relationship with Cuba these days?
Yesman,
do you want to take that to start with?
Yeah, I mean, the flow of immigrants have reduced a little bit, but it still exists. The government's response to this is that there's not such thing as an immigration crisis. No, people leave the country because they want. I mean, they don't like Venezuela. Venezuela is the greatest country on earth, according to the government. But numbers tell us otherwise. It actually, people leaving the country is a great deal for the government, and recently they've been trying to find a way to also get a profit out of the revenues coming from people outside Venezuela, right? So yeah, there's still an immigration crisis, and the relationship with Cuba is very, very close. Actually, the events in the last couple of days, the manifestations in Cuba affected here so much that the main figures of the government even tweeted about it. And they were saying, "Oh, Cuba is an indivisible country, and the empire will not be able to say that." Remember that we even have military Cuban figures here in Venezuela telling the government should they take, and basically is on a rough scale is just a copy of the Cuban model here in Venezuela. I remember 20 years ago when they say that that's exactly what Chavez wanted, people were saying, no, it's impossible in Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is a lot bigger than Cuba. We have a lot more resources than them. We have had a democracy for 40 years. There's no way Cuba can happen here in Venezuela, but as you can see, Cuba can happen anywhere. It's just a matter of politicization of every single space of daily life.
Interesting to see those protests on the streets of Cuba over the last few days. And I guess that I think there were certainly fears and concerns about that possibly in Venezuela too.
Nick, if I can just do a two-pointer on the question on the immigration, answering that question. I mean, we need to also be cognizant that for many months now, essentially since the beginning of COVID, the borders between Colombia and Venezuela and Brazil have been technically closed. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there's no migration. What it means is that the migration needs to be done through illegal routes, where the migrants are usually subjected to all kinds of violations of human rights, rapes, people are murdered, kidnapped, etc., etc. But the flow continues. Colombia recently opened the border unilaterally. It's very complicated because Colombia and Venezuela do not have diplomatic relationships, not even at the lowest level. And something that Crisis Group has been advocating for is to establish some channels of communication, particularly to deal with the border question, which is a giant one. Venezuela was very mad when Colombia opened the border unilaterally because, as Yesman said, they want to try and stop the flow, but as soon as the border opens completely, we are expecting that there's going to be an influx of immigrants into Colombia again. COVID has obviously all throughout Latin America made what was a very difficult situation really an unbearable one for thousands of people. So I think if and when the borders open, we're expecting to see a massive flow. Also because in Colombia, the government has, at least for now, paid lip service. We'll have to see how this is implemented, but they have given TPS, temporary protection status, to the Venezuelan migrants that are present in Colombia. That means giving them papers, allowing them to have to work legally, and to have access to some social services. Not that the Colombian state provides that many social services to its people, but a few. So there's obviously an interest from the Venezuelans who are in the most desperate situation to perhaps be able to go into Colombia into that TPS category.
That's quite a step, isn't it? That's quite a significant. I mean, politically for Duque to do that, because I think Venezuelan refugees can be quite unpopular in some places and well welcomed in other areas in Colombia. But it's a contentious thing to do politically, isn't it, Renata?
Yeah, I have to say, it was a very surprising move from Duque for us. We did not expect it, but a very obviously welcome one. The way to deal with the immigration crisis is to try and integrate people into society rather than to marginalize them even more. The levels of xenophobic discourse in Colombia and elsewhere throughout Latin America against the Venezuelan community is very worrisome. Naturally, there are some Venezuelans that are involved in crime because they have very few possibilities, and this is just kind of the product of desperation in most cases. So it was very interesting that the Duque administration did take this move. That said, we'll have to see how this works in real life, right? Like people have to have documentation about when they enter the country and in what conditions, which with a lot of the Venezuelan immigrants, that's not a possibility because people came through trochas and illegal entries, so they don't have stamps in their passports. Actually, Venezuela stopped producing passports, I don't know, Yesman, how many years ago? For many, many years, Venezuelans have not been able to get a new passport, which means that a lot of people don't even have an ID. So how this is all going to work, you know, that was always on the details. We'll have to see.
Yeah, well, I think outside of the Middle East, it's the biggest refugee crisis in the world. That's really quite something, and it's really something I think doesn't get enough attention.
And it doesn't. It has not achieved like a minimum attention from the international community in terms of aid in comparison with what Syria and other refugees crises have happened around the world. I mean, it's competing obviously with very difficult crises, but it is very worrisome. That the UN barely ever manages to reach the required donations that they're asking. The governments in Latin America have all proven to be not very generous towards the immigrant population, and the refugees, the Venezuelan refugees, are really facing very, very difficult situations.
And arguably, possibly the channels through the Colombian state and other states to actually channel that aid to them. There are ways of delivering that means which are quite easy to identify. Let's bring in some more questions. Diane Cook, who is in the UK. Go ahead, Diane.
You're both, as I listen, not positive, but it sounds like Maduro is going to be there. My question is, what are really the threats to Maduro? Are they from his own party? Are they from the military? Or are they from criminal organizations?
Who John?
Yeah, I can start and then Renata can add. I'm sure she's got a lot to say about this. As I see it, the rhetoric of being under threat is something that helps the government a lot. And a very good example for that is the detention of the congressman yesterday. He's being detained allegedly for organizing an attempt of magnicide. And that's how they framed the whole event of the Cota 905, right? So for the government, they're always under threat. The U.S. are always plotting to assassinate Nicolas Madura, but I think they should be a lot more worried about the internal disputes. After Chavez passed away, he left some fractions of power inside the PSUV, the Socialist Party. And those fractions of power have been struggling. Again, it doesn't mean they're divided. It means that they're just internally facing challenges. In my personal opinion, I would say right now, Maduro is not threatened by anything. But again, that's my personal opinion. I may be wrong. And I would like to hear what Renata has to say about this.
Go on.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to agree with you. I think the real threats are very little. Very little. I think for a moment, maybe when Trump was sort of feeling interested in invading Venezuela, maybe that was a threat. But at this point, there's very little. I mean, it's important to note that Chavez first, but also Maduro have made a very concerted effort to get the military on their side. And that would be the one actor within Venezuela which you would expect that perhaps could step in at moments of crisis and decide to take over when the situation became desperate. But they clearly are not doing it, in part because they have been, I mean, I'm saying this a little bit crudely and I apologize for that, but they've been bought by the Chavez and Maduro administration. They've been given positions of power. They've been giving a lot of rewards for being loyal to the party, and there is incredible numbers of corruption both among the state functionaries but also the military. So that would be the one actor. I mean, I think if the Venezuelan people were able to organize themselves and perhaps go out of the streets and sort of have demonstrations and protests such as the ones that we saw in 2017 and before, maybe that would be something that would worry the country. I mean, Maduro, just because there is this wave of protests happening in other parts of Latin America, and perhaps they wouldn't be able to get away with repressing them as they did then. But for one, the division between the different sectors of the opposition is such that it seems that it's difficult, but also I think, as Yesman said, people are worried with like surviving the day, right? Like trying to be able to eat and such. There's not that much space in people's lives to really try and organize politically. So I would say the military or an uprising in the population might be, but that's nothing that I see as very likely in the near future.
We've been talking for 50 minutes and we haven't mentioned the word once, COVID. What has been the impact, Yesman? I mean, and that really does affect the economy as well. And I guess things couldn't have been worse than they were a few years ago. So in a way, the rest of the world has, hasn't had it as bad as Venezuela has had it for a long time. What has been COVID's impact, Yesman?
Well, yeah, COVID's impact is really hard to measure here in Venezuela, and only because one thing, and Renata mentioned it earlier today, that the government won't give figures, and the figures they give are not credible in most of the cases. So the COVID crisis here in Venezuela, we say we have, the government says we have around 200,000 cases, near 2,000 casualties. But the doctors inside the hospitals report that those numbers are not very trustworthy, right? So the estimations the doctor makes is that those figures can be 4 times as high. But again, it's just estimations. There's not an actual way to report all the COVID crisis. Obviously, before COVID hit, there was a hospital crisis here in Venezuela, health crisis, no medicine whatsoever, no resources, not even gloves. I mean, back in the day, and this is a reality, is still in some hospital. If you want to get a surgery, you would have to go yourself and buy everything the doctor needed, from the scalp to the gloves to the cotton to the alcohol, everything. You would have to buy everything for you in order for you to get that surgery. So when COVID hit, this hospital crisis was a little bit more evident, but at the same time, the international help aided the government a little bit. That they were receiving some help from China, for example, some help from other South American countries. They have implemented this scheme, what they call the 7x7 scheme, where you have a flexible week, which means all the economic activities are open and free for those 7 days. And then the next 7 days, everything's closed. Only the food shops and primary shops will be open. The effectiveness of that measure is still left to be measured. If you look at the government numbers, they will tell you it's the best. But again, there's no real proof that has been the case. They had to come with this idea of the 7x7, because in a country where almost all Venezuelans work on a daily basis to get the daily food, you cannot have a very long quarantine. You cannot just tell people, go and lock yourself in your houses and starve until I decide, right? People needed to go outside the street, and at some point the government say, okay, nobody's allowed in the street, and people would say, okay, I don't care, I need to go out, I need to work, I need to bring food back home. So, and they realize that, and they say, okay, we need to be a little bit more flexible perhaps, and then they say, okay, let's go with this. 1 week everything will be open, and 1 week everything will be closed. In the practice right now in Caracas, for example, there's no respect whatsoever for that scheme. I mean, everybody's just in the street wearing the face mask. That I'll give you that, but there's no social distancing. There's no particular protocols in order for us to prevent the spread of COVID.
And has China been providing vaccines? Who's been bringing vaccines in?
Very little. The government says they have vaccinated 11% of the population, but that's not very accurate figure. Once, because these vaccines are multiple dose vaccines, so which means that in order for you to be actually vaccinated, you need to get at least 2 doses, and the government has just been given 1 dose to everybody, and they don't know when they're gonna give the second one. And the other thing is that the government, it's gonna start vaccinating people with this Cuban vaccine prototype. Is not even approved to be a vaccine, called the Abdala, and they say they have received 5 million doses of that, but I mean, everybody's a little bit worried about the effects that vaccine may have.
Right. Okay. Understand.
And Nick, we should mention that Venezuela was obviously one of the countries that would be eligible to get vaccines under the COVAX mechanism, but there was a problem in that.
Would or wouldn't? Sorry, yes or no? It will.
It would. But recently, Venezuela, countries that get through COVAX the vaccines, they have to pay for them anyway, but they sort of secure like a certain number of doses. And the payment that Venezuela made was actually stopped in Switzerland for a few weeks because of the sanctions. Oh, that's at least what the Maduro government is saying, that it was blocked because of the sanctions from the US. So for many weeks, the payment didn't go through, so they couldn't get the vaccines. That finally all got resolved last week. And so the hope is that the COVAX mechanism should be able to bring the vaccines to Venezuela. But Venezuela and Haiti are the two countries in the region that have the smallest rates of vaccination, and as Yesman said, the real numbers of contamination are probably enormous. I mean, I know that just anecdotally, speaking to people in Caracas in the last few months, everybody knows a ton of people that have been like, it does seem like highly unlikely that the numbers that
my dad almost died. My dad almost died with COVID. Thank God he's fine now. But it was like this, and it was one of these ridiculous things when the doctors refuse to see the patients because they say, we don't have face masks, we don't have gloves. I mean, are we going to expose ourselves to the patients are just there sitting, waiting for someone to bring, and in some cases it has to be yourself. You go to the shop, buy a package of gloves and say, okay, can you see my dad now, right? And they say, okay, of course I will. But the situation is like that, and I'm talking about the capital. If you look at it from the point of view of the little inside the country towns, it's even worse. I mean, they don't even have doctors. They're just sitting there dying, literally, right? So and those cases go underreported. Those cases, they would say that he had a heart attack, and in some cases, especially we've seen this when the violence peaks were hitting, when we have like 100 casualties a month. The government will say like, no, hide it. Don't mark it as a homicide. Mark it as something else, heart attack. For example, guy with 20 shots on the chest, oh, he died of a heart attack. And it's the same with COVID. People's dying, and the government's maybe underreporting. Again, it's really hard to find proofs because there's no documentation whatsoever. There's no institution to go to in these cases. But it's something that we can see on a daily basis.
Okay, so just to try and recap a bit here, you've got a moribund economy with little potential for growth, from a very, very low base. You've got sort of political stasis. You've got Washington not likely to lift sanctions because you mentioned, Renata, huge pressure, political pressure, particularly in Florida. So it doesn't seem like anything's going to change anytime soon unless Maduro decides he can do some compromise for recognition and sanctions being lifted. Are the Chinese, are the Russians doing anything? I'm just trying to see if there's any other, they've managed to intervene in other areas and gain political advantage. Renata, are they doing that?
They're managing to block any movement of this in the Security Council and the UN, and pretty much make sure that that the situation doesn't evolve much. We have been following closely what's happening in Moscow and the connection with Caracas. We're sensing that Moscow might be getting a little bit impatient with the situation, also because Moscow has a lot of money invested in Venezuela, and the way that this is going, they're never going to be repaid. So perhaps they're getting to a moment where, like, okay, like maybe we need some movement here, so we don't lose all of our investment. Obviously, for Moscow and for China, Venezuela is, from a geopolitical perspective, an incredibly important place, so they're not going to back off. And that sort of power struggle between the US and China and Russia has been very, very clear at the UN. But granted, so you have to think like, how are relationships between Biden and Putin going to be evolving? Is there going to be any space for perhaps collaboration on Venezuela as the case where maybe both countries align? I don't see China, Russia as particularly productive at this moment, but we are sensing a little bit of, particularly from Russia, of less interest, less engagement, and then perhaps a bit of flexibility towards trying to get a negotiation happening. China, on the other hand, I think is seeing Venezuela, and they have done the same in many other countries in Latin America, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, where they've invested massively, particularly on infrastructure and oil. And so they want to make sure that their investments and their, you know, with Trump sort of disengagement with Latin America, China came in and filled that space really, really fast, and they're not willing to really lose it. And I think in the case of Venezuela, they know that this is something that could be very well good for them, particularly in economic terms. So I see China perhaps even being more obstructionist towards movement. But I think everybody is sort of understanding at this point that the only way in which the economy is going to really change, and there might be a way to resolve this, is if there is a clear election where Venezuelans might be able to elect somebody else. And so as that kind of becomes more and more clear, perhaps the international community overall can press on Venezuela and China to, I mean, on Russia and China to really try and press Maduro to organize elections that are clean. I mean, obviously we don't know who will win under a clean election, right? Like Chavez was reelected multiple times. Maduro was also reelected multiple times.
We're running out of time here. So Yesman, very briefly, and then we'll wrap up. There is what we do now. We have a break in a second. So there is possibility to stay on for the discussion afterwards. But Yesman, very briefly, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, well, I agree with Renata, and China and Russia has been slowly disengaging from their relationship with Venezuela, particularly because they're not getting any profit out of it. They have seen the situation in Venezuela as businessmen, and they have treated this very pragmatically. And at some point during Chavez's government, China will borrow lots of money for him to, you know, leverage his government, and in order for him to spend that money, getting a lot more support. But right now, I don't see that kind of support with Maduro. I think everything moves towards a little bit. They did protecting their investments, and they might be thinking about maybe a little change here would be good.
There we must wrap it up. Do stay on the line if you want to join our conversation afterwards, just for a few minutes. But just to say my thanks to both of you. Thank you so much. That was a really good overview of what's been happening in Venezuela. My thanks to Yesman Utrera and to Renata Segura from the International Crisis Group. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you for the invitation.